my name is John Park, Director of the Korea Project. On behalf of the Korea Project, the Cyber Project, and the North Korea Cyber Working Group, welcome to today's conference entitled North Korean Cyber Operations at the Nexus of Geopolitics, Technology, and Policy. Today's conference is an outgrowth of the Belfer Center's research on North Korean cyber operations. The Korea Project has devoted several events this year to cyber issues on the Korean Peninsula, including a full panel during our third Harvard Korean Security Summit in July. We continue to engage with leading scholars and practitioners working on North Korean cyber issues, both here at the Belfer Center and at other institutions around the world. Situating North Korean cyber operations at the intersection of multiple disciplines, today's conference also reflects the Korea Project's belief that bringing together specialists with diverse functional and regional backgrounds can lead to fresh insights. Today, we'll hear from researchers, who approach this topic from very different perspectives, technical and non-technical, regionally and globally focused, and as scholars and as practitioners. One of the Korea Project's key priorities is to develop and provide a platform for the next generation of researchers in the Korean security studies field. Through the North Korea Cyber Working Group, the Korea Project brings together emerging scholars from academia, the policy community, and the private sector. Now in its second year, the North Korea Cyber Working Group has already generated important findings. A report from this past March by Alex O'Neill explored North Korea's cybercriminal statecraft model for generating revenue through illicit cyber means. Another report from this past May by Millie Kim, June Lee, and Rachel Beck analyzed North Korea's exploitation of the cryptocurrency ecosystem. These reports and other research by the North Korea Cyber Working Group members have contributed to our understanding of North Korea's cyber operations. I'd like to now introduce June Lee, who co-leads the North Korea Cyber Working Group. June's research focuses on the law and policy surrounding cyber conflict with a focus on the Indo-Pacific. She's previously worked as a program coordinator and researcher at the Carnegie Endowment's Tech and International Affairs program. June graduated from Stanford with a BA in International Relations, a minor in computer science, and honors in international security studies. Over to you, June.
Thanks so much, John, and thank you everyone for tuning in for our conference today. As John mentioned, the goal of the North Korea Cyber Working Group is to generate new analysis and ideas for combating North Korean state-sponsored cyber activity. We do this by bringing together next-gen researchers from diverse fields to conduct original research, hosting networking events, and convening private and public events, such as this one. Today's conference could not be more timely. In the past few weeks, tensions on the Korean Peninsula have escalated rapidly, with North Korea launching a record number of missiles, including several yesterday and this morning, and hinting at a potential nuclear test. While headlines have focused on kinetic threats from physical weapons, the threat from North Korean cyber capabilities persists. North Korean cyber criminals continue to conduct cyber espionage operations against targets of interest to the regime. Crypto operations provide North Korea with the funds to further its WMD capabilities. And the use of destructive cyber capabilities could complement and potentially intensify the harm from kinetic attacks. The US, South Korea, and Japan, alongside other countries, have pursued renewed cooperation to counter this threat, participating in joint cyber military exercises, law enforcement coordination, and increased cyber information sharing. Yet continued thinking and innovative solutions are required as North Korea continues to exploit the gap between policy and cutting-edge technology. Our conference today will begin with keynote remarks from Dr. Jackie Schneider, followed by two blended panels of experts and working group members. The first panel will focus on novel approaches to countering North Korean cyber activity, while the second will discuss geopolitical implications and opportunities for international cooperation. And with that, let me introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Jackie Schneider is a Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institution and an affiliate with Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation. Her research focuses on the intersection of tech, national security, and political psychology, with a special interest in cybersecurity, autonomous tech, war games, and Northeast Asia. She's a non-resident fellow at the Naval War College's Cyber and Innovation Policy Institute, and was previously a senior policy advisor to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Before beginning her academic career, she spent 6 years as an Air Force officer in South Korea and Japan, and is currently a reservist assigned to U.S. Space Systems Command. She received her PhD from George Washington University. With that, Dr. Schneider, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. That's extraordinary what this group is doing. And you mentioned a little of my background, and that's kind of where I want to start, because almost 20 years ago, I was sitting in South Korea, a brand new 22-year-old, maybe 23-year-old lieutenant, and I was sitting in the watch in Osan Air Base. And the North Koreans had just developed what potentially was going to be a long-range ballistic missile, the Taepodong. And they were launching short-range Scuds and intermediate-range ballistic missiles from the coastline. And just a few months later, they would test a nuclear weapon. And at the time, we really felt like this was kind of as good as it was gonna get, right? Like it was a shocking moment for North Korea to introduce themselves as a nuclear power. But over the last 20 years, that threat from North Korea has only become more dangerous. And the interesting thing coming from a cyber perspective is that relationship between the cyber capabilities will look extremely different. And the missile and nuclear capabilities, which are really threatening instability in the peninsula. So I think for so many years, the question when we looked at North Korea was whether they could do two things. And those two things would be the most important to the balance of power and stability within the peninsula and broader East Asia. And the two questions were, could North Korea win a war against South Korea? And the second question was, could North Korea reach out and threaten the US but beyond the peninsula? The first question was, could they do it against US forces in Japan? Then it was US forces in the Pacific, and finally US writ large. Now, in 2006, when I was first in South Korea, the answer to both those questions was no. In 2006, the conventional asymmetry between North Korea and the combined, at the time it was not, the US forces Korea and the CFC, the combined forces, was, there was no question that the North Koreans could not win. And in fact, that delta between the US and South Korean capabilities and the North Korean capabilities really led to big doubt that the North Koreans would ever make a significant intrusion into South Korea. But in 2006, this starts to change with the development of the nuclear capabilities and the missile capabilities. And so over the last 20 years, what we're finding is that even while the conventional capability of North Korea to defeat a US South Korean force has not really changed and has not gotten significantly better, the asymmetries of conventional power are perhaps even greater now than they were in 2006. But the ability for the North Koreans to reach out and threaten beyond South Korea has significantly increased. And at first it was the Japan, and now reaching out with cyber attacks to all the way to the US homeland. And being able to do this, being able to reach out and touch and threaten the US increasingly further from the peninsula, all while maintaining, the Kim family maintained control. And this is a bit of a kind of extraordinary story, because in 2006, when we were staring at this problem, the general consensus within the intelligence community was that any significant transition of power, especially in a North Korea that was facing declining economic potential, a population that was generally famished, that the North Koreans would not be able to continue to invest in these high power missile capabilities, and that increasingly the Kim regime would not be able to stay in power. And when Kim Jong-il passed away, there was there was a lot of hope that this would lead to a regime change. What has happened is a remarkable consolidation of power despite no increase in economic power. So, okay, so all this is not talking about cyber, but it comes back to cyber because cyber ends up playing a huge role in the ability for that Kim family to maintain control and to be able to continue to threaten the United States in a way that makes the conventional asymmetry of power less important for the North Koreans. So they've done this in two ways. And the first is the obvious. This is the development of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, right? So the development of becoming a nuclear state that can reach out and touch US territories becomes an extremely important element in the Kim regime maintaining control and in changing that asymmetry of power that really was a huge delta before the advent of nuclear weapons in North Korea. But how can a regime that has so little money manage to make such a technological leap? And a large part of this is related to cyber, which June already alluded to, but the fact that they're able to use cyber capabilities, not just as an asymmetric threat against the United States, but instead as a way to bring in revenue for the ballistic missile and nuclear program and to keep the Kim family in control is a remarkable testament of the grand domestic and international power of cyber. And it's interesting in comparison to the way the West has often thought about cyber power, cyber as a bomb, cyber as a substitute for conventional military power. And here we see cyber not as a substitute for conventional military power, but instead as an asymmetric coercive tool in its own. And not a coercive tool to necessarily change behaviors, but instead to generate revenue and to support the development of bombs. So not cyber as a bomb, but cyber as the development of bombs. So cyber in North Korea matters. But I mean, I'm telling a group of people that knows this. Nothing I've said is new to what you guys are doing. So what I want to really leave you with is how do we better understand this problem? This problem matters. It matters not just because of the economic threat of these cyber attacks and the proliferation of these cyber actors threatening critical infrastructure. It matters because it ends up increasing the ballistic missiles and the nuclear capability in North Korea, which in the end can be extremely destabilizing. So how do we better understand this problem? Now, when I used to run war games for the DoD, we used to bring in North Korea experts to play North Korea. And I always said, why are we doing this? Let's just bring in like a magic 8-ball. Well, anybody who says they know what the North Korean regime is going to do is full of it. And it's better to actually sometimes be probabilistic about the way you think about their decision making. All that to say, there's so much we don't know about the way in which decision making occurs that it becomes an extremely difficult subject to study. And that's why your efforts are so important. All right, so I broken down these kind of three groups of potential research questions into three bins. And the first is, substantively, how do we understand the problem? What is the nature of the problem? So how are these North Korean cyber actors organized? How are they financed? What are their motivations? What is the chain of command? What is their relationship with the domestic regime? These are, these can be answered technically, either by chasing the money or chasing the cyber. And then capabilities. Where is this human capital coming from? Where are they trained? Where are their technical resources? And then, moving into kind of effectiveness, how do we think about the extent of the economic damage? You see wide ranges of estimates everywhere, but who is this damaging? What are the industries that they focus on? How do they generate their targets? How do they think about who they're going to be going after? So this is all about characterizing the nature of the problem, which I think a lot of people on this call are already doing great work to better understand the overall nature of the problem. And I think once you know more about the nature of the problem, you can get to the question of kind of how that problem could be used in potential scenarios. So how might the North Koreans use cyber operations at the beginning of a crisis? What would be the types of targets that they would be going after? Would they change their tactics from what we see on a day-to-day basis? Are they able to convert what they've become so good at with ransomware and convert that to a much kind of harder government or military target? And this leads to the other question, which is more theoretical, which is what are the conditions under which these cyber actions that the North Koreans might take could be destabilizing? Or what are the actions they could take that could give them an asymmetric advantage? Are there decisions that the South Korean military is making or that the US military is making about the way in which it develops its networks, the way in which it deploys its data-enabled resources that might give the North Koreans some sort of advantage? Like, how should we think about resiliency in dealing with the North Korean cyber threat? Is that something that the US military and the South Korean military really even need to think about, or are these too hard of targets for the North Korean cyber actors? And I think outside of this context of crisis and war, there's a larger question about whether there is an overarching economic advantage that the North Koreans get to a point where they have created so much damage or so much financial cost from their cyber attacks that there becomes like a tipping point where they're able to actually use cyber in a way to change the asymmetries of power. Or if there are particular industries in which we might see like a very significant tipping point of asymmetry of power. I think kind of, more in a kind of a broader sense about how the US and South Korea think about fighting wars or deterring North Korea, have the North Koreans been able to use cyber in a way that decreases the intelligence advantage of the US and South Korea? How do we need to think about deception? Can we think about deception at all? Should the US and South Korea still be thinking about fighting the same types of campaigns they've planned for? Or should they assume that there's some sort of cyber information advantage that the North Koreans have gained? I think broadly, we're seeing this play out in Ukraine and Russia, where cyber, and especially the information that cyber might give to either side, can reveal information about targeting, information about campaign objectives in a way that changes the battlefield advantage. And it allows states that are able to access vast amounts of digital information, gives them an advantage they might not normally have. So can the US and South Korea still expect to be able to conduct the same operations they would prior to kind of the cyber revolution that the North Koreans have advanced on? And I think this leads to the most important questions, which is, I really think what your group is probably like designed to do, which is the solutions to the problem. And this has been such a problem for policymakers when thinking about North Korea. I remember in 2006 when I was sitting in Osan, and it was before they had tested the nuclear weapon, and the 4-star at the time was a guy named General B.B. Bell. And I was a brand new lieutenant, and he came in and he said, "Lieutenant, what should we do if the North Koreans test a nuclear weapon?" And I had just come from some, classes at Columbia. And I said, "Nothing," because there was this kind of the fear at the time of the artillery that was on the border was a very strong deterrent. And this has kind of been the answer to the vast majority of North Korean aggression, North Korean buildups has been kind of shows of force and not a lot of solutions. They've circumvented many sanctioned regimes, either with the support of the Chinese or with cyber bringing in revenue. So we need to, I think, if we can provide solutions to the policy world about North Korea, more tools to potentially deal with these problems, then this is a huge advantage and a huge kind of value add that this group can provide. So some problems that I was kind of thinking through about how this group could help. I think work that looks at that financial link between cyber and the missile programs or the nuclear program, and how to think about cutting off that financial link. That becomes an extremely important potential solution, and one in which we've already seen some experimentation being done with some success. What can we do in the United States or in South Korea to work with private firms to decrease their vulnerability? So, I mean, this is kind of agnostic to the North Korea problem, but how do you incentivize critical infrastructure to protect themselves? And then how do you build government institutions in order to provide classified information, for example, about North Korean attacks? I think here in the US, CISA and Cyber Command are increasingly being very effective at releasing information about North Korean actors through usually DHS. And then thinking about kind of campaigns and military orders of battle and balances of power, I think it would be helpful for both the South Korean and the US military to understand the ways in which they may be most vulnerable to North Korean cyber attacks, even if the answer is you're not, right? But are there particular types of targets that the North Koreans might be going after? Are there some that some tactical data links or information kind of repositories that are potentially vulnerable to North Korean attacks? And then the follow-on kind of recommendation from that is how does the US and South Korea build the networks and the capabilities in order to be more resilient in that case? And like any good academic, I'm going to give you a bunch of questions and no answers. And then I want to reiterate how important I think your group is and how exciting it is to see concrete, rigorous work about this problem, which in the past has been an extremely, extremely tough problem to research. So thank you again for having me. Excited to hear more from all of the participants.
Thanks, Dr. Snyder, for excellent keynote remarks there and setting the stage so well for us in the panels ahead. I'd like to now turn it over to Alex O'Neill. And by way of introduction, he'll be moderating the first panel on novel approaches to countering North Korean cyber operations. Alex is coordinator of the Korea Project and a co-lead of the North Korea Cyber Working Group. His research focuses on North Korean financially motivated cyber operations, especially links between North Korean cyber actors and Russian-speaking criminals. His most recent publication is Cybercriminal Statecraft, North Korean hackers' ties to the global underground. Alex holds a master's in Russian and East European Studies from the University of Oxford and a BA in History from Yale University. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks very much, John. And thank you, Jackie, for those excellent framing remarks. Good afternoon, everyone. As John said, I'm Alex O'Neill. I'm the coordinator of the Korea Project here at Belfer and a co-lead of the North Korea Cyber Working Group. I'll briefly introduce our panel 1 topic now, as well as our 4 panelists, and then we'll dive right in. The focus of this session, entitled Novel Approaches to Countering North Korean Cyber Operations, is a new twist on a very familiar topic. We've often sought to define and understand North Korean cyber activity by looking at the motivations, key players, and pathways involved. We've looked especially closely at North Korea's cybercriminal statecraft, the model the regime has pioneered for generating illicit revenue through cyber means. Today, we'll focus on the other side of the equation, which is defending against and countering malign North Korean cyber activity. We'll cultivate a set of actionable recommendations and take a close look at recent innovation in policymaking circles, in law enforcement, and in the private sector. With that in mind, we've assembled a panel representing many of the key stakeholders in this issue, and I'll introduce them now. And I invite our panelists to please turn on their cameras, but keep their mics muted. First up, we have Ashley Chafin-Lomonosov, who's a cybercrimes investigator at Chainalysis, the blockchain data company serving the public and private sectors globally to enable investigations and compliance in the crypto space. Ashley focuses on East Asian issues, especially North Korea's tactics, techniques, and procedures in blockchain. Great to have you back with us, Ashley. Helen Lee is a member of the North Korea Cyber Working Group and a researcher with 38 North. Helen's research focuses on cyber power on the Korean Peninsula and on the role of the United States in East Asia's cyber conflicts. She recently published an article in The Diplomat entitled The Future of South Korea-US Cyber Cooperation. We also have with us today Prashil Patni, who is a principal threat intelligence analyst at BAE Systems, where he researches state-sponsored cyber espionage and financially motivated activity from high-end cyber criminals and state-sponsored threat groups. Prashil specializes in tracking North Korean threat actors, and over the past 5 years, he's analyzed numerous campaigns, including activity against SWIFT and ATM systems, as well as espionage against the defense and aerospace sectors. We're glad to have you with us, Prashil. And last but not least, we have Ayoung Shin, who is an analyst at the ROK Embassy in Washington, D.C., as well as a member of the North Korea Cyber Working Group. Ayoung's research interests include North Korean financially motivated cyber operations and the implications of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence for cyber from a national security perspective. With that, we'll dive right in. For our first question, we'll start with Ashley, and then we'll go around to Prashil, to Helen, and then to Ayoung. So Ashley, to start us off, I wonder if you could describe the current North Korean cyber threat in your own words. What are you most concerned about right now?
Thanks for having me this evening, Alex. I really appreciate you. To answer your question, with the most realistic response possible, the financial element of the cyber threat is ever growing. It's extremely taxing to try to figure out what the severity of the problem is there. So being cut off from the global financial system, North Korea should not be able to sustain an economy, yet they still are. So coming from Chainalysis, a blockchain analytics firm, my employer, I'm concerned with how they're funding their economy and how they're continuing to fund proliferation efforts, keep their people alive. It's really, really arduous to me.
And Prashil, same question to you. What are you most concerned about with regard to the North Korean cyber threat?
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I think that there's definitely a fair amount going on from North Korea right now. And certainly they're making a lot of money from the cryptocurrency sector, which is of concern. I think the one campaign in recent memory for us that was a bit more unique from the cyber perspective and tracking things was a lot of their espionage activity against the aerospace and defense sector. And this was kind of activity where they really put a lot of effort into their social engineering in it, going to victims over LinkedIn, Twitter, WhatsApp, posing as recruiters, ultimately hoping to get a compromise of personal devices and then move to corporate networks through that. And from us, being part of an aerospace and defense firm, it's really quite hard to pick up and defend against those, especially if your employees don't know about that threat. Most people know the risks behind an email, but aren't really expecting a recruiter with kind of hundreds of connections, seemingly part of a legitimate organization with mutual connections with you on LinkedIn, to actually be a nation state adversary. And they definitely don't put all that kind of effort in social engineering all of their campaigns, but the fact they had that kind of awareness and ability to do that with some of their campaigns where they thought they needed that extra effort to get that initial intrusion vector was definitely quite interesting for us.
Definitely. No, it's a great flag. Helen, we'll go to you next. What elements of the North Korean cyber threat are you most concerned about right now?
Thank you, Alex. I think for me, adding on to what has been said, the most concerning element is that North Korea cyber actors are very opportunistic. So kind of like what he just said, they've been using LinkedIn to do Operation Dream Job, but they're not just using LinkedIn. They're using everything and all the geopolitical context that's going around them. For example, when the recent Kakao Talk fire happened, allegedly and potentially, North Korea also used that as an opportunity to do some spear phishing attacks against North Korea-related defectors and academics. I think the fact that our world and our international order is getting more chaotic, and there are just more opportunities for North Korea to use to leverage their cyber attacks.
Thanks, Helen. And Ayoung, same question to you on the elements of the North Korean cyber threat that you are most concerned about.
Thank you, Alex. So among many different North Korean cyber threats, I think the potential malicious use of advanced technologies like artificial intelligence in particular in cyberspace is most concerning to me, because AI augmentation in cyber can significantly enhance cyber campaigns in terms of scale, speed, and success for both offense and defense. But since North Korea has prioritized offense over defense, I think it is more likely that North Korea might be interested in augmenting offensive cyber campaigns with AI. And although North Korea appears to be at an early stage of AI development compared to the US, South Korea, or China, they can really speed up AI research and development by taking advantage of the lack of regulations around AI and also the high level of openness in AI research. So this means that North Korea can easily exploit open source data and commercially available software like deepfake generation to leverage AI for their cyber campaigns. Like they already proved how they could freely operate in the murky regulatory cyberspace before. So lastly, there's a China piece. So in addition to using open source data, I think North Korea can also build on educational exchanges with countries like China to gain access to the information and hardware that are otherwise not available.
Thanks, Ayoung. I wanted to ask you a follow-up on that. I wonder if you could speak a little bit further about North Korea's innovation in the AI space in particular with relevance to cyber. I know you've been looking into that as part of your research project with the working group.
Yeah, thank you. So North Korean regime has long prioritized science and technology development, especially in information and technology sector. And they have been very publicly celebrated their breakthroughs in AI in state media and journal publications. And in fact, in 2019, top universities like Kim Il-sung and Kim-Chaek universities, they announced that they are going to build new AI-related courses and departments. So I think such continued investments in AI by the regime really indicates that they might be interested in building AI and machine learning technologies in cyberspace. So hypothetically, if once North Korea achieves a level of development in AI, they could supercharge their financially motivated cyber operations like cryptocurrency theft or ransomware attacks for revenue generation at scale by using AI augmented credential harvesting or social engineering techniques like phishing attacks. And this will be very harder to detect and more successful. And in fact, from my research, phishing can benefit the most from AI as North Korea mostly relies on phishing attack. But it is also very resource intensive because the hacker needs to do a manual detailed research on the target, befriend the target, and create a personalized messaging for phishing. So in this sense, if they could use AI technologies for their phishing attacks, AI systems can not only automate the entire process and those routine tasks like selecting the target, researching about the target, and finding vulnerabilities and executing attacks, but specific AI programs like natural language processing program can also tailor text or audio visuals to make them appear more authentic, convincing, and targeted. And also AI-generated deepfakes, they are already available online, can mimic the behavior of human and even engage in a conversation via text or voice. So this all means that North Korea might be interested in AI augmentation to launch far more effective and successful phishing attacks with less personnel and cost, which will be very appealing to North Korea in light of their very limited labor force with foreign language skills. And lastly, in fact, North Korea appears to be conducting extensive research in NLP, like keyword extraction, machine translation, and voice recognition technologies. So I think these are some innovations that have taken place that are very interesting.
Thank you for that, Ayoung. Super comprehensive. and quite frightening as well. But I know Prashil mentioned in his opening comments, spear phishing and threat posed that way. And so if they're able to potentially use AI to like you said, supercharge the spear phishing tactics, then that seems like a very serious problem. Ashley, I wanted to ask a kind of broader question to you on the evolution of the North Korean threat. I wonder what innovation you've noticed in the course of your work, focusing especially on the crypto and blockchain space in the last couple of years.
First and foremost, the creativity has evolved. All of the phishing attempts, whether we're speaking generally or specifically, have just gotten more involved and more creative over the years. So yes, you have individuals, hackers spending a lot of time and resources building friendships, but as they're moving to an AI or a bot-like existence, they're optimizing their processes and procedures and successfully breaching more systems. In terms of the cryptocurrency industry specifically, obviously we have seen an extensive amount of hacking, breaking, entering, theft, data stealing, but also ultimately funds seizing as well. The technical acumen of each of the hackers or the hacking groups has gotten extremely advanced. They're consistently evolving with the technology in the decentralized finance space, which Ayung said, like, could show an evidence of successful education and how much they're investing in education. So as far as the evolution goes, yes, there's the creativity of the initial attack vector, but what's also important to note is that they're operating mostly in the decentralized finance space when they do steal this cryptocurrency. So they're blatantly moving their funds about the blockchain without a regard for privacy or anonymity like they used to. So it's, from a psychological perspective, just very interesting to see how their tactics have kind of evolved. And I could get deeper into the crypto space, but I'll pass it off to the next respondent so that way we can get all sectors involved.
Definitely. And I think your comments raise a couple of follow-up questions. We'll hold those for now and come back, just like you said. Prashil, I want to give you the same question on the recent evolution of North Korean cyber threats. And I wonder if we can draw on your background in threat intelligence to kind of round out the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I think from our perspective, and the threat actors we're particularly interested in, like Lazarus, I think we've said it a few times now, there's kind of always just been two halves to kind of conduct espionage and gain intelligence and then steal money to fund that intelligence. And we've said that a few times now. So maybe a bit of a less glamorous evolution is that those priorities and those things haven't changed that much. They're actually held quite strong. But actually tracking from the cyber perspective for us, how they've handled those two priorities over the years has actually been quite interesting. So they were obviously quite prolific at targeting banks prior to the pandemic, which the kind of cessation of travel put a halt to that, and their cryptocurrency campaigns really took off. But from our perspective, all that tooling and knowledge and infrastructure that they had created doesn't just go away. So a really interesting evolution for us was seeing what happened to all those hallmark tools that Lazarus and North Korea and so on had made and relied on those bank compromises. And we could actually draw quite a nice line from that pandemic hitting, moving away from the financial sector. Those tools then got retasked into kind of cryptocurrency trading applications for a short period of time, and now most recently have actually come full circle and put into use for their espionage campaigns. And when it was kind of their hallmark tools and particularly their primary backdoors and things like that, it kind of gives us a sense of perhaps what their priority is at any one point. That priority of getting money hasn't really changed, but often at times we've seen what they're looking to gain intel on the espionage side change a lot. The defense sector has always been of interest, but it seems to adapt to their priorities. And so the targeting of vaccine research when the pandemic was at a height, and then recently even the targeting of security research is quite unique to seemingly fund their own vulnerability research. I'd say there's nothing too glamorous in their innovation, particularly on the threat intel side, that overall a lot of their tools have improved. So the kind of cryptography, the OPSEC of their infrastructure, and all these kind of things, they're slowly cleaning up flaws from previous years and mistakes, and a lot of times adapting open source code as well. We've seen that. So yeah, I'd say maybe the best innovation they've taken is just really improving their operational security, kind of over generations of these tools.
It's a really interesting point. And like I said for Ashley, that kind of threw up a couple of different follow-up questions. We'll circle back in just a moment. Helen, I want to go to you next with sort of the other side of that question. I wonder if you could speak about how the toolkit for countering North Korean cyber threats has developed over the last few years. Are there new capabilities that are available to policymakers or law enforcement or private sector partners?
Thanks, Alex. I think I'm going to answer your question mainly from the South Korean government and policymaker point of view. Definitely in the last few years, I think especially since 2019, South Korea has done a lot of investing and put a lot of attention into their policy work and how to deal with cyber attacks, specifically North Korean cyber attacks. So in 2019, well, I guess let me go back a little bit more. Since 2014, when the 2014 KHMP hack happened, I think South Korea really started realizing that cyber attacks from North Korea was something that needed the attention of higher level policymakers. So it established different training centers like the Cybersecurity Training and Education Center. And within that, they established the National Security Research Institute, which now hosts cybersecurity academic conferences for various topics, including for cryptography. And it also started overseeing different types of training exercises, such as a cyber conflict and exercise contest to train for crisis response capabilities. So all these different agencies and trainings and academic conferences are creating a new capability for policymakers as well as the private sector to engage with the policymakers of South Korea to do more information sharing and to collaborate on what the next North Korean threat might be and how to defend against those threats. And I think from then on, especially since 2019, we started seeing the National Cybersecurity Strategy and the National Cybersecurity Basic Plan, which really put South Korea at the forefront of working on international and bilateral cyber cooperation with the United States. So then since then, we saw in 2020, 2021, and 2022 annually, we saw joint statements between the United States and South Korea, different communiques discussing stronger cooperation, closer communication, deeper coordination in the cyber domain. And most recently in May 2022, we saw that the joint statement created a working group, which actually already did meet in August once. And actually today, the 54th Security Consultative Meeting between the US and ROK counterparts took place, and they released a joint communique reaffirming strengthening cyber cooperation and reaffirming their support for this cyber working group that was created in May. So I think mostly we have definitely seen an increase in policy tools, different agencies and personnel that can be targeting or that can be responding to cyber attacks from North Korea. And I think that's reflected in the recent Belfer Center's cyber power ranking, that showed that South Korea is now the sixth cyber power in the world, which it wasn't there a couple of years ago when it first released that ranking.
Gotcha. Thank you, Helen, for that. Ashley, I want to go to you next. Based on your perspective as someone working, one, in the private sector, but specifically on the sort of blockchain analysis angle, I wonder if you feel that in the last couple of years, your capabilities, or at least the capabilities of your company and firms like it, if those have expanded, and then especially in the blockchain department. You mentioned that North Korea has been exploiting decentralized finance, plenty of other cryptocurrency angles, exchanges, bridges, things like that. I wonder if you feel that the capabilities in your field have also expanded over the last couple of years.
Thanks, Alex. They've absolutely expanded, and it's a beautiful, incredible, awesome, growing space. You know, you're taking a philosophical concept of making the financial system open to more people, despite maybe not having access to banking or otherwise facing barriers that don't allow for access to traditional finance. And the beauty of that is that yes, tools are growing, efficiencies are being created, capabilities are being created as well. And as the technology itself advances, so do the people, but also so do the bad actors. So the unfortunate side of the crypto industry, the blockchain industry growing, is that a lot of people recognize the business potential there and are hoping that they can turn a quick profit by getting into the industry as a relatively early adopter. And the result of that is exactly how North Korea is successful. People are, especially in the decentralized finance realm, rushing to put up liquidity providers or smart contracts that maybe don't have the best either code security or, in the cases of companies, network security. And because they're not investing time and resources into setting up, you know, a great business with proper cybersecurity practices or a completely solid contract code for smart contracts, DPRK has also at the same time invested in their education and their hackers' abilities and can now exploit those. And because this is a, you know, innovation, the industry as a whole is an innovation in financial technology, there's a lot of money flowing around. And unfortunately, North Korea has found an absolutely ideal way to exploit that. And oftentimes the decentralized finance is, like, realm is trustless and permissionless, and often it exists because it aims to remove the intermediaries from financial and other transactions. So they're doing this without anyone in the way to stop them. So
I'd like to go to Prashil next. Same question on how the toolkit has expanded, but I want to ask both from an instant response and whether it's attribution or sort of breaking down the TTPs on the one hand, but then also on the defense and cybersecurity side on the other hand. I wonder if you feel that your toolkit, your capabilities have expanded.
Yeah, definitely. I'll probably speak towards the kind of tracking of threats and that threat intel side. But what we always say when we're tracking these groups is that we're pretty much tracking their choices, and particularly when those choices touch the internet. And so the infrastructure behind all these North Korean groups, where do they buy their domains from? Where do they host their servers? What web server or software do they want to use, and so on. And over time, I'd like to say things have developed in our favor, as threat actors actually just have more and more options in those choices as the internet has expanded. And then the tools, both in private and public sector, have improved to track those choices. So things like your internet scanners, malware repositories, DNS repositories, and etc. Trying to make all these different choices with no patterns that we can track is really quite difficult for anyone, let alone those North Korean groups, particularly when they aren't quite aware of the patterns that we're exploiting. And so trying to ensure randomness for all those different choices is a lot of work, and countering for us those cyber threats through tracking them can be quite fun, trying to figure out which combinations of choices actually results in resilient patterns for tracking. I don't want to paint too much of a rosy picture for the kind of threat intel method of tracking North Korean groups through their infrastructure and malware. And the flip side to all of this is that as we've got more and more ways of tracking them, of how these groups interact with the internet, when people blog about those things, and as you want to do when you've done some really interesting research, things can get quite tricky. And so the groups themselves are starting to understand how we track them as well. One definite recent example was a tool called Dackles, and this received a number of fairly detailed blogs on its use and how to track it in 2020. And we could almost draw a line between those blogs coming out and the tool going away effectively and the infrastructure going away. And only just a few months ago now, we've picked up that tool again, and the infrastructure and the malware is vastly improved, and all the ways we were using to track it before are now gone. And we can never know if they actually read those blogs, but it definitely feels that way from the tracking perspective. But yeah, definitely, I think the toolkit for us has always been trying to figure out what their malware and infrastructure is doing, and that has paid kind of great dividends for us, both in the threat intel side and the incident response side.
Well, it's a super interesting point because on the one hand, it's clearly such a technical field, right? You have to be very specialized. You have a lot of highly technical tools. And on the other hand, there are some sort of psychological or decision-making elements to it as well. And so it's interesting to kind of blend those two together in that field. Priscilla, I want to stay with you for a moment and just ask a sort of related follow-up question, which is we've spoken thus far about things that we are paying attention to, areas where we do have innovation and our capabilities expanded. Kind of conversely to that, are there areas that policymakers or that private firms like your own or like others should be paying more attention to? Are there tools that exist but that have gone underutilized, essentially?
Yeah, I think for this point, I might wade to the cryptocurrency sector, as there's kind of a lot going on there, and perhaps more that could be done. We've obviously seen from the policymakers' perspective sanctions. I don't want to speak too much out of turn, as policymaking isn't really my expertise, but sanctions have been great for kind of combating things and money laundering post-compromise. But it would be great to see some attention given to things kind of pre-compromise. I think we often assume with the cryptocurrency sector that it doesn't want to be regulated, or maybe it can't be regulated. But it also seems to be moving that direction on its own. And we recently finished up our kind of yearly stats for kind of cybercrime in the cryptocurrency sector, as well as North Korea. And what we kind of found there was this idea of auditing in the cryptocurrency sector, which has already become kind of its own ecosystem there, where you now have organizations that are specifically selling services to audit smart contracts in your application. And then people and these organizations get an audit done and then kind of use it as a seal of approval in some sense, kind of putting it on their documentation, their website, their Twitter, and so on. It sounds like a logical idea, but what we ended up finding was that most kind of victims of cryptocurrency heists this year either didn't do an audit, or they just done one or two. And then they kind of plastered on their websites that they had those audits. In the rest of the software development world and the kind of traditional finance, we'd never be able to release a product or an update of a product without some kind of red teaming activity. And there's a lot of kind of documentation on how you develop software in a secure manner. So it would be great to see policies or standards that start helping with that field of auditing, making sure you're getting audits from organizations who know what they're doing, updates every release, and kind of scope correctly. And then hopefully you start giving more weight to that statement as we've been audited per kind of XYZ standards.
You mentioned crypto and DeFi and blockchain and smart contracts. So I'm going to go back to Ashley for your take on what policymakers should be paying more attention to, or what tools exist that have gone underutilized. And then we'll go to Helen and then to Young after that.
Priscilla really did nail it there. It's incredible. First of all, I'm not a policymaker. I do deeply, deeply appreciate the art and science and psychology. I mean, take your pick of all that goes into policymaking. And a lot of what we've seen in the crypto space has been really effective, but it's also given pause to users in the industry. Because again, the nature of decentralized finance is to remove regulation and intermediaries. So yes, Priscilla made a great point with these smart contracts, and these decentralized applications do get audited. And they use that as a seal of approval, and then they make changes and never get audited again. And that, leaves room ripe for exploitation. The other potential issue in the industry is that there are a very, very, very small number of companies that are trusted and technically able to audit these smart contracts, right? The space is ever evolving. Some contracts are written in a coding language that was created less than 5 years ago. So, there's a lot of room to grow and learn in the industry. But then I've heard that the wait time to get some of these well-known contract audit firms to review your project is upwards of 18 months. And I go back to what I said earlier about how people are rushing to get into this space to turn a profit, which is valid. There's a lot of room for growth and, revenue here, but it comes at a cost in that you right now could deploy a smart contract on, take your pick, blockchain network, and people do. And sometimes they're doing it without being audited. So in terms of, tools that policymakers either underutilize or could pay more attention to, the sanctions have been great and revolutionary recently, but obviously that doesn't stop crypto activity. So one really, really great example that I'd like to explain is that the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, designated Tornado Cash in August of this year. And Tornado Cash is a decentralized, as in no intermediary party facilitating these transactions, code-based, smart contract-based mixer. And basically what its goal was to obfuscate the source of funds from the destination of funds. It was very, very, very heavily utilized in some of the DPRK activity that we've seen this year. And the Treasury Department, alongside US law enforcement, alongside global law enforcement, was able to take the website down in most parts of the world. However, because what you put on the Ethereum network in that case and other networks, but what you put on the blockchain is permanent, you can still route funds through Tornado Cash. Now, presumably, you wouldn't want to do business with the US global financial system at that point because you're working with a designated entity, but sanctions have been good, except that doesn't really stop the problem. It just kind of forces illicit actors to do something different. And again, back to Prashil's point, you do this awesome research, you do this awesome thing, and you want to tell people about it and you want to publish it and talk about it. But that kind of disrupts the research and like seizure element of it, where for so long, we could see through these smart contract interactions and understand exactly where North Korea and other illicit groups were routing their funds. But now that they, well, in theory, shouldn't have Tornado Cash to use, they've been forced to find other methods. But as I said, you can still route funds through such a mixer. So sanctions have been great. But other tools, education is paramount. They're only 24 hours in a day, but the quicker you policymakers in general get up to speed on what is happening in the crypto industry and all the intricacies and just players in the space and technical like features of an ever growing element of finance, the quicker they'll be able to act and make a very comprehensive, very reasonable policy.
Some really interesting points. And I think, Ashley, you identified two really helpful tensions there in that sort of crypto blockchain DeFi space. One of which is the tension between building out as quickly as possible your user and your revenue growth versus having good cybersecurity practices. There's a sort of inherent tension there. What do you focus on first with your limited resources? But also the space, it sort of markets itself as promoting autonomy and freedom and anonymity in certain cases. And on the flip side, right, it seems like based on what you were saying and what Prashil was saying, there's been a push for, in some cases, more sort of scrutiny and regulation to make sure people aren't being stolen from. So I think some really good flags in the comments that you made. Helen, I want to go to you from more of a policymaking perspective. I wonder if you could speak about what policymakers should be paying more attention to, and if there are tools that exist but that have gone underutilized.
Yeah, I think I'm going to start with something I mentioned earlier about how starting in 2019, South Korea really came out to focus more on international and bilateral cyber cooperation, and specifically with the US as we see. One thing is that this year, South Korea did participate in some multilateral cyber exercises with the United States, but bilateral ones just don't exist yet. Also, I think one thing that both South Korea and the United States have been crucially missing is that there are comparative advantages that we need to really use and leverage in this space. So for example, in 2019, South Korea and the United States cooperated on taking down a child abuse website called Welcome to Video. It was a South Korea-based site, and it used Bitcoin transactions. So it actually started with tracking Bitcoin illicit transactions and eventually led to this huge child abuse site. What made this operation really successful is that it used the power of the US IRS, so US's economic and financial power, but it also really utilized Korea's knowledge about cryptocurrency as well as their regulations, which are a little bit different from how the United States does it. And although this was not against the DPRK, if we were to use comparative advantages like this against DPRK cyber attacks, for example, using the United States economic power, as we just heard from Prashil and Ashley, sanctions have been working to a certain extent. And that's something that only the United States can do. That's something that South Korea cannot. If we can use that in conjunction with South Korea's knowledge about North Korean cyber attacks, motivations, and capabilities, as well as the language and cultural background and law enforcement mechanisms, the two nations can do a lot and make a lot of progress in stopping and preventing future North Korean cyber attacks. I think one thing that South Korean policymakers have been really missing is information sharing. the culture in South Korea, as well as the policies that are existing right now, just are not, they don't guide companies in private sector to report cyber incidents, to require information sharing. And the culture is that none of the companies want to share it because it's going to give away trade secrets, or it's going to make them more disadvantageous economically. So if South Korea can focus a little bit more on the prospects of information sharing, I think that's that'll create a lot of progress for South Korea as well. And finally, I think South Korea has not, and the United States can do a lot more in private to private partnerships. A lot of the North Korean cyber attacks that we see are not against the military. They're against the private sector, or against people on LinkedIn, or against the chemical companies in the UK. If the companies of various nations can work together to figure out what is a better way to defend against these cyber attacks, first, they have a lot more incentive to do so. And second, we can actually defend against the cyber attacks that are happening in that sector. And one example of that is, I mentioned this before, but in 2014, KHNP, which is South Korea's hydronuclear power plant, got hacked by North Korea. In 2021, they signed an agreement with US utility service alliances to develop better defenses against cyber attacks.
Those are really great points. And I think underlying a lot of what you said is that, it's easy to say cooperation, right, on a Zoom call here and a Zoom webinar, but the actual mechanics of getting different countries, different law enforcement organizations, different private sector companies to cooperate either with each other or with the government, those mechanics can have a lot more friction than you would anticipate. It's a really good flag, Helen. And then Ayong, we'll go over to you next. What should policymakers be paying more attention to, and what tools exist but have gone underutilized?
So from AI perspective, I think they should be paying more attention to the regulatory environment, because extensive regulations on access to open source information and technologies do not exist yet. So as I mentioned earlier, North Korea can really exploit the lack of regulation for AI. So recognizing this risk, they should first understand how the North Korean regimes acquires AI capabilities so that they can tailor regulations to address educational exchange and knowledge transfer, along with limiting their access to technology itself. So specifically, they can develop AI-specific norms, regulations, or technological solutions that focus on the three fundamentals of AI development, which are data, computing power, and talent. So they should be developed so that policymakers can prevent any malicious use of AI for cybersecurity. And one way to do so is to develop and distribute security tools for common security problems in AI systems. And another approach that they can take is similar to good cybersecurity. They can promote a culture of social responsibility and ethical standards in the use of AI technology or AI research, and also promote the security of open source information and software as well. And lastly, it's equally important to monitor the progress and proliferation of AI relevant resources, like through regulations like international data protection. And examples of these tools can be one, introducing pre-publication risk assessments in technical areas of special concern, like adversarial machine learning, so that they can determine what level of openness is appropriate in AI research and development. And another example can be building AI-specific procedures for responsible disclosure of AI vulnerabilities.
Thanks, Ayong. It's great to have this sort of balanced private sector policymaking, all kinds of different perspectives in this area. I wanted to follow up real quick. Unfortunately, we only have about 5 minutes left. So I have a quick follow-up question for a couple of the panelists, and then we'll turn to our sort of final lightning round, if you will, just a recommendation. We'll go there in a minute. I wanted to ask the two folks here who are from the private sector, so Prasheel and Ashley. Helen mentioned in her remarks public-private partnerships. I know you guys work extensively with different governments, but I wanted to ask, generally speaking, Do you find that your capabilities, that your talents in the private sector are properly utilized? Or are those relationships as efficient as they could be? Are there ways that those relationships could be improved, either by expanding them, right, covering more ground, or are there sort of certain practices that I think would make those relationships, those partnerships more effective? Ashley, if we could start with you first, and then Prashil.
Yes, absolutely. I spend a very, very, very large part of my work week educating, and that's been the most incredible and truthfully fulfilling part of my job, where I am constantly working with the public sector. And I'm very thankful for the opportunity to do so too, because they're open to learning. Crypto is a very, very weird space. Crypto is a space where if you try to figure it out and teach yourself from the internet, you're going to get lost quickly, because there's so much information out there, and some of it's misinformation, some of it's not complete information, some of it's old information, even if it's, only a couple of months. So they're really, really willing to learn and listen and absorb, and then figure out how to apply any information that I can give them that will help bolster their workflows. Areas for improvement, getting the public sector to talk amongst themselves is really, really difficult sometimes, because in the United States specifically, it comes down to budgets and respect for lines of communications and data streams, and the limitations that they face internally with regards to security and communications mostly. But it's something that I'm always promoting. I'm connected to a lot of different intelligence bodies, a lot of different agencies, even within the private sector too. We talk to a lot of people to make the industry as a whole better. And I'm constantly putting them in contact with each other and just hoping and encouraging that they can share amongst themselves, because I can talk for 40 hours plus a week, but if they ultimately can't operate without maybe tapping into US FBI or, some other body that has either the authority or the ability to help them out, their jobs won't be the most complete. So education is key. And please, if you work in the public sector, talk amongst yourselves. Your colleagues are great.
It's a good suggestion. And Prashil, same question to you on how to make these private-public partnerships more efficient.
Yeah, I think might not be the perfect answer that you're looking for, but in the UK, I think we're quite privileged in that the NCSC here has done a really nice job of actually doing exactly that. So for me to add on more recommendations to what the NCSC here could do, I think I'd probably struggle. But they've done some really great work with the Industry 100 scheme, kind of bringing in private sector into kind of their workflows and things like that, and getting that dialogue with a lot of private sector companies. So if anything, maybe the recommendation would be kind of seeing how the UK's NCSC managed to get that kind of pattern down and get us all working together. And if you could replicate that in your own countries, that is and has been a brilliant resource. So yeah.
Definitely. No, it's quite helpful. And I think Ashley was saying before that we have to get within the US government, different organizations talking to each other. And I think if we can also have different governments in different states learning from each other, right? The US, the UK, Helen and I have been talking about South Korea in particular. Hopefully we won't be learning from North Korea. But it's quite helpful. And I think that's a really important point. We are almost out of time. So I'd like to ask one final question. And it'd be great if folks could give just very brief, like 30-second responses, just as we go around. If you could distill your broader thoughts on this topic into just one recommendation, either for policymakers, for law enforcement, or for folks in the private sector who are working on these issues, what would that one recommendation be? And again, just in 20 or 30 seconds, if you can. I know that's a tall task. But Helen, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Young, and then Ashley, and we'll finish with Prashil.
Okay, I think drawing from what Ashley and you said about how we need to talk to each other, I think what I mentioned before about using the comparative advantages of two nations, and not just in an international scheme, but even within one country and within the private sector, if we could talk to each other and decide on or figure out what the comparative advantages are that we have and utilize those against North Korean cyber attacks, we'll make a lot more progress.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Young, over to you.
So for the US and South Korean policymakers specifically, I would recommend them
to prioritize developing AI-enabled cyber defense mechanism and maintain technological edge in AI so that they can be really well prepared for any possible AI-powered cyber attacks, either from North Korea or other illicit actors.
Thank you for that. And Ashley, over to you for your recommendation.
Yes, since I've already harped on education enough, my parting thought is just to anyone in the industry, really, don't rest on your laurels. Like, North Korea is always looking for the next cutting edge technology and the next advantage that they can take to exploit the industry and fund whatever they need to. So be open and very, very willing to learn new things.
Super helpful. And Prashil, you have the final word, your recommendation, either to policymakers or law enforcement, the private sector, or anyone who is relevant in this discussion.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we've said today has come down to that a lot of this relies on North Korea getting money, and right now they're getting money from the cryptocurrency sector. So my one recommendation would be similar to what Ashley was talking about before. Sanctions have worked well. Tornado Cash is hampered, but there's going to be more organizations like that. And from that kind of incident response perspective, we never want to be making those calls when an incident has happened. So for law enforcement to kind of engage with those organizations, those prospective launderers for the future would be my one take.
Thank you. Those are all really great recommendations. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our panel, but I think that was a good way to conclude a lot of sort of forward-looking food for thought, if you will. I'd like to say another big thank you to our panelists, to Ashley, Helen, Prashil, and Ayung for your contributions today. Really great discussion. Too bad we only had 45 minutes, but we'll continue these conversations, I'm sure. Many thanks as well to everyone in the audience for tuning in for this session. And with that, I will hand it back to June for our second panel. June, over to you. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alex. And thank you to our panel one panelists once again for joining us for this conversation. Our second panel will, in a bit of a pivot, focus on geopolitical implications and opportunities for international cooperation. So recent events suggest that North Korean cyber activities are clearly not a regionally constrained issue. Countries from the Indo-Pacific, Southeast Asia, and the West are all affected by North Korean cybercrime, ransomware, and espionage. Dr. Schneider highlighted in our keynote remarks that cybercriminal activity and North Korea's crypto activities are funding developments in North Korean missile and even nuclear capabilities, which we've seen all over global news this week. The focus on international cooperation is not a new approach. Yet North Korea's continued exploitation of cutting-edge technology suggests that tight coordination among governments, private sectors, and non-state actors, relying on that expanding toolkit that we discussed in panel one, is needed. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce the panelists who will be shedding some insight into this topic. So if our panelists could turn on their cameras and unmute themselves, turn on their videos and unmute themselves, I'll introduce them one by one. So David Park is a senior policy advisor in the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, TFFC. Previously, David was the first U.S. Treasury representative to Korea, where he advised U.S. government officials and agencies on North Korea sanctions, economy, and illicit financing, and sought ways to work cooperatively with ROK institutions. David has also held appointments as senior advisor to the acting assistant secretary and deputy assistant secretary for TFFC, a staffer to Senator Joe Donnelly, and an officer in the U.S. Air Force. Welcome, David.
Great, thanks.
Hugh Millie Kim volunteers as the director of research for the North Korea Cyber Working Group. She recently obtained her Master of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown University, where she researched applications of AI, cybersecurity, and information operations as a graduate research analyst at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology. She has previously conducted research on North Korea and Indo-Pacific security at CSIS. Welcome, Millie.
Thank you.
Jenny Jun is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council Cyber Statecraft Initiative and PhD candidate at Columbia University's Department of Political Science. Her research focuses on building a systematic logic of cyber coercion using formal models. Jenny also conducts research on North Korea and security issues in East Asia and is co-author of the 2015 report, North Korea's Cyber Operations, Strategy and Responses. Good to see you again, Jenny. And finally, last but not least, Nigel Vincent is a former research assistant for the Tech and National Security Program at CNAS. His research interests focus on Australian foreign policy, US-China competition, cybersecurity, and US alliance structures in the Indo-Pacific. Previously, he has conducted research with the Reconnecting Asia project at CSIS and studied Chinese economic and intellectual trends in Hong Kong. Welcome, Nigel. Awesome. Great. So to kick off our panel, I'll be asking kind of a bigger picture question, and we'll start off with responses from David, Jenny, Melanie, and then Nigel. So how do key players in Northeast Asia, especially but not limited to China, South Korea, and the US, think about North Korean cyber operations? And what tensions exist between their approaches? We'll start with you, David.
Great. Thanks for having me, June. And it's a pleasure to be here along with my fellow panelists. As a government employee, let me start off by saying that the views expressed today are those of my own and not those of US government or those of the US Treasury Department. So having said that, in terms of the key players, when it comes to North Korea cyber, I think obviously the United States and the ROK are obviously the two biggest. China, if they're want to be a willing partner in this endeavor, would I think be a major player as well, because of a lot of the illicit financing that goes through China, whether it's through fiat currency or even through cryptocurrency. But relations between the United States and China aren't at the best right now, and obviously China has their own strategic interests in playing the current role that they play. So it's kind of tough to kind of get a sense of their views on this. As you know, China has banned the use of cryptocurrency within their jurisdiction, but we still know that a lot of illegal crypto activity occurs. So I think for the United States, this is definitely a key issue, especially when it comes to DPRK and countering their illicit revenue generation, certainly for the ROK. And we're definitely in close contact and coordination with the Korean government to see how we can work together, share information, and just find areas where we can kind of mirror up our resources or match up our resources so that we can go after this problem. I think this, June, you mentioned this past week, we saw an unprecedented number of missiles launch over a 24-hour and then a 48-hour time period. So, it clearly shows that, North Korea continues to able to procure the funds for their weapons program. So just making sure that we're working in close partnership, not only with the Korean government, but with other allies and partners in the region, because there's a lot at stake for them as well to tackle this problem. I think is kind of the approach that we're looking at.
Great, thanks so much, David. And yeah, same question to you, Jenny.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything that David has said. I think this is more sort of an issue for US and South Korea and probably less so with China. The China connection comes in, as David said, because they, a lot of the activity comes out of there, and also a lot of the Chinese nationals have been identified as basically facilitating the cash out process in the cryptocurrency laundering process. I think sort of another dimension to think about, I guess, is sort of the Biden-Yoon summit in May. I think signaled a great interest in both countries, kind of broadening and also deepening cooperation on cyber issues. And within months, of that summit happening, we saw sort of a lot of initiatives. The governments were in conversation before, but like really taking off. Officials have been flying back and forth, and releasing press releases, DC and Seoul, and we're seeing discussions occur, not just on North Korea cyber operations, but sort of on a wide variety of fronts. And also South Korea, I think, is making moves not only to strengthen the bilateral relationship with the US, but also join other multilateral initiatives like NATO CTCOE, although like that process has been rolling for quite a bit. but also like participate in things like the ransomware summit that like occurred earlier this week. So I think over the next year or so, we're probably going to see a lot more sort of deeper alignment between US and South Korea on cyber issues on many fronts. And so with regards to that, I think China is probably more worried about North Korean cyber operations bringing US and ROK closer rather than about North Korean cyber operations itself. And so, I mean, obviously, like that's not going to, deter US and ROK from cooperating, but that's probably what China is thinking more in a strategic dimension.
Really interesting points. Thank you, Jenny. Maybe same question to you, Millie. I know you've done some research looking into kind of the North Korea-China cooperation, especially in AI training and R&D. So if you could focus in that area as well, would love to hear your response.
Yeah, I agree with Jenny on kind of China's perspective, kind of their reaction to South Korea participating in the US-led cyber flag exercise in October kind of demonstrated their wariness of closer US ROK cyber cooperation. Before touching on like the North Korea's China research collaboration on AI, which I hope to get to later in the conference as well, I just wanted to kind of bring in another key player in the region being Japan, having shared kind of interests with US and South Korea on cybersecurity cooperation. And I think this kind of trilateral relationship, they're well positioned to cooperate on strengthening cybersecurity. But obviously some of the tensions that exist with progressing on trilateral cooperation in the cybersecurity space is obviously how the US can harmonize its bilateral cybersecurity cooperation with both South Korea and Japan, and how South Korea and Japan can strengthen their own ties in cyberspace, and for example, how to overcome capacity and structural differences between some of the agencies and organizations that carry out cybersecurity in each of the countries. So for example, in US and Japan, having structural differences in how they handle civilian side and military side cybersecurity is kind of one of the obstacles or tensions that exist between kind of how getting the shared interests and aligned interests in strengthening and enhancing cybersecurity cooperation to actual practical steps. And I think the multilateral cyber exercises is definitely a great first step for the three countries to see how they can cooperate in information sharing and also capacity building for cybersecurity.
Great, thanks so much, Millie. Last but not least, Nigel, over to you. Same question. How are key players in the region thinking about North Korea cyber operations, and then any tensions in those approaches?
Of course. Well, with all my panelists kind of hitting all the nails on the head, when you look at U.S. national security interests, of course, within the Indo-Pacific, North Korean cyber operations collect illicit finance that builds out their nuclear modernization campaign and also the military modernization campaign. You also see as well North Korea targeting financial institutions in developing countries, whether that's in South Asia or the South Pacific, which creates financial instability. So in terms of the US approaches, a lot of it is about deterring North Korea's cyber operations, whether in the financial space, but also disinformation as well, while also increasing interoperability. In terms of China's strategic interests when dealing with North Korean cyber operations, I think it's very interesting, and David and Jenny both hit on this point, is that Beijing tends to run this balancing act where on one hand, it sees the overly aggressive behavior of North Korea within cyberspace as somewhat undermining its own stability in terms of its own ability to engage in the cyberspace for its own interests, but as well, it also sees those same activities essentially helping it out because it's undermining U.S. national security interests within the Indo-Pacific. And many times, as well as we've talked about before, Japan, South Korea, also some of our research hit on Australia as well. A lot of these operations have attacked U.S. allies and like-minded countries within the Indo-Pacific.
Okay. And really helpful responses. Thank you, everyone. And I'm glad the kind of the U.S.-China dynamic came up, both as context, but perhaps not as relevant in terms of the immediate cooperation. And that's a thread that I'd love to come back to. Next question, looking big picture beyond just those major players. Many countries in the region, Southeast Asia, Australia, Oceania. I'd like to turn first to you, Nigel, in terms of how have North Korean cyber operations, really affected other countries in the region, and what approaches have those countries taken to manage the threat? And I'm really curious to hear a bit about, you've been doing some research on those public-private partnerships and kind of the Australia context, so bringing a little bit of a different angle.
Yeah, of course, of course. So when you look at North Korea's cyber operations within the region, you see North Korean hackers tend to go after the low-hanging fruits. So in many instances, if this is not corporations, it's often developing countries. So some of my research has focused on the utilization of PPPs, or public-private partnerships, to kind of help out these developing countries build out more robust cybersecurity frameworks. So some of my research has actually focused on Internet 2.0, which is an Australian-based cybersecurity startup, but it's also based in DC as well. And it's worked with the US State Department within the South Pacific island region, focusing on building out some of these cybersecurity frameworks that can better help out government institutions, but also financial institutions that are being targeted by hackers that are emanating from North Korea. One of their main successes has been Fiji, where Fijian government officials, but also financial employees were given training by the US State Department and also Internet 2.0 together to help them in understanding how to deter, but also detect North Korean cyber operations, especially dealing with cyber crimes that were attacking key financial institutions within SUPA.
Really useful. Thank you, Nigel. And the kind of the startup world is one that I feel like we don't really see, involved in combating nation state financial crime and ransomware. So really interesting. I think, David, I'd like to ask you a similar question in terms of North Korean cyber crime, financial activities. It's prevalent in Southeast Asia, affecting a lot of countries in that region. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to what activities countries in that region have taken to combat North Korean cyber operations. And if you're able to draw on the bigger geopolitical context currently as well, with a lot of U.S. attention in the region under the guise of kind of U.S.-China competition, and how, if at all, that's impacting international cooperation.
Yeah, I think Nigel brought up some really good concrete examples. So I just want to kind of build off of that. In terms of what those countries are doing, honestly, from my perspective, I honestly don't see them doing much. And the reason is, everyone is jumping on this whole, virtual asset cryptocurrency train. I think governments naturally are just slow. I mean, big institutions like governments, it just takes the bureaucracy a while for it to move, even for smaller countries, like certain countries in Southeast Asia. So it's tough for them to kind of keep pace with what's going on in the technical world. And so I think that North Korea knows this, they're exploiting it. And like Nigel said, it's the low-hanging fruit. And so I think when you're a developing country and you've got a whole lot of other issues at play, now you've also got to deal with this cryptocurrency cyber issue. And it's tough. They may lack the expertise or they may lack the resources. And so a lot of the work that we are doing, and when I say we, the United States, in close consultation with allies and partners like Japan and South Korea, is to think about capacity building, how we could do outreach and how we can do engagement with these countries so that we can, first of all, highlight the illicit activity that's happening through the jurisdiction and how that could pose potential risk, not only from a financial perspective, but maybe they may be in violations of existing sanctions, right? Particularly US sanctions. And so one, we highlight the risk, and two, we talk about how, what measures they need to take. And we offer assistance as to areas where, we think they could bolster their defenses, or areas where where they feel they need to bolster defenses. So there's an ongoing effort right now. It's somewhat in the nascent stages, but really we haven't seen any government really able to tackle this issue. And I'm thinking largely in Southeast Asia, single-handedly or even regionally. I mean, we saw the Sky Mavis hack this year, right? 620 million of virtual assets stolen, right? And I think that just goes to show that, I mean, it happened in Vietnam and they were kind of like caught flat-footed. They may have a burgeoning economy when it comes to dealing with traditional financial payments and that system, but when it comes to virtual assets and cyber and crypto, I think that's an area where we just have to work, be a little bit more focused on and work closely with that region.
And really, really useful insights, David. And if I could just follow up, kind of a train that was, it's a consistent theme in the previous panel had to do with kind of public sector governments, not speaking to each other, or perhaps not enough channels existing for that communication. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to kind of what you've observed in terms of information sharing, or that kind of communication. Are things improving, and any improvements that you hope to see perhaps going forwards?
Yeah, I think we're headed in the right direction. We've definitely seen some improvements, a willingness for these countries to have this bilateral or even multilateral engagements, because they understand that this is definitely an area where they don't want to fall behind and potentially risk, being exposed to U.S. sanctions, or who knows what other type of issues, right? I mean, the last thing you want to be known for in the public arena is, to become like the next Vietnam and have hundreds of millions of dollars stolen, and basically tell the rest of the world that your jurisdiction is basically open to bad actors coming in and stealing resources. So I think it's well in their interest to do that, to make sure that they mitigate for those vulnerabilities. And so I think that the constant engagement is important, and I definitely think that they're willing to talk with us, and we're certainly willing to talk to them. And it's definitely it's going to take a while, and I think that the learning curve might be a little bit steep for some of these countries, but at least they're willing. In fact, I think in 2 weeks there's going to be a symposium in Korea, on crypto symposium hosted by the State Department. And that is a symposium that has invited regional allies and partners, as well as members of the private sector. And so I think that this is another great opportunity for us to get the word out and look at how we can work more closely together, both in the public arena, but also in the private.
Really helpful additions. Thank you, David. I think definitely, with recent legislation in the U.S., it seems like the public-private, incident reporting legislation and that kind of coordination is improving. And, the U.S. seems to be more advanced in that area and perhaps more willing to speak with the private sector than other countries. So really good to hear that initiatives are advancing in other countries as well. I think, continuing with the thread of North Korean cybercrime, crypto financial activities, Jenny, I'm wondering if we can turn to you a little bit, and with the Countering Ransomware Initiative Summit happening this week, ransomware has been on the agenda in the U.S. for a while, and we know that North Korea is a large actor there. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to how North Korean cybercrime affects global financial and economic stability, and how some of the approaches the Biden administration has taken in terms of increased cooperation, or things like the ransomware initiative, how that's changing the global approach, other ways that we should be approaching this issue.
Yeah, thanks, June. I mean, so I think in the grand scheme of things, like currently there are probably bigger fish to fry with regards to global financial and economic stability, with like inflation. Like there's other bigger stuff going on beyond North Korean cybercrime. But like David said earlier, like you could say that a rampant Korean cybercrime could pose sort of serious threats to sort of the integrity and trust that investors have on smaller countries, especially like Vietnam. And if North Korean, like they're doing this less now, but like if they're targeting money in central banks, right, like and stealing like hundreds of millions of dollars, that's gotta have an impact. And just this sort of reputation to become known as that country who gets hit over and over again with these sort of like multi-million-dollar scams, and does nothing about it, says something about their sort of domestic policies and hygiene. So in that way, I think it does matter. But I don't think like, like as we even saw in things like the Bangladesh bank heist, like it doesn't necessarily sort of erode trust in the entire SWIFT system overall, right? It's more like a blip in the radar, and people are still going to go back to using it sort of business as usual. And so, I do think, North Korea's cybercrime did contribute to, US government's, increased willingness to coordinate with partners, like they said, sort of regulating the cryptocurrency ecosystem, along with, what they're experiencing within the US with the spike in ransomware attacks and payments. So this is going to continue. So also sort of in response to the previous question on what they're doing in Southeast Asia, I think one report that was interesting to me was Malaysia's decision to extradite a North Korean national, Moon Chul-myung, to the States. So I don't know like what kind of strings were being pulled and pushed behind the scenes, but I think more sort of cooperation on that front, where collaborators with this North Korean criminal network, whether they're North Koreans or nationals of countries that are in concern, like that kind of stuff is promising, and changing behavior on that front, I think is sometimes, there are less sort of legal hurdles and domestic sort of politics to get by, and legislating domestic law through their, National Assembly. And it just requires sort of a switch in behavior. So, things like that might be, practically easier to achieve. I don't know.
Yeah, no, really helpful flag just in terms of the, obviously the differences in the law enforcement and like legal frameworks for each country, and that perhaps opportunity, perhaps obstacle in approaching this issue. I'm wondering, same question to you, Millie, looking a little bit at the Southeast Asia context and countries like Indonesia, how have they been affected by North Korean cybercrime and, steps that they've been taking?
Yeah, I agree with previous comments on how that there's a willingness to act, but a kind of a lack of capacity to kind of reach their goals. So looking at ASEAN cybersecurity frameworks, the second one that covers a span of from 2021 to 2025, it is pretty comprehensive in terms of the goals that they have laid out for information sharing between ASEAN member states on between the computer emergency readiness teams for each ASEAN state, and also kind of their focus on critical infrastructure. We saw Indonesia Indonesia was heavily affected by WannaCry in 2017 with critical infrastructure like hospitals being shut down. So kind of a wake-up call for Indonesia after this cyber attack, but also smaller scale cyber attacks, increasing wariness of kind of cybersecurity, the need for greater cybersecurity in other Southeast Asian countries as well. And we see this with, Malaysia trying to coordinate a cybersecurity agenda, and the Philippines releasing their national cybersecurity strategy this year. So I think there is a general willingness and acknowledgement that this is a priority, but there's definitely a lack of capacity and a lack of cyber governance, and also regulatory frameworks that can help these countries meet their goals. And I think lastly, a big kind of talent gap and training programs for cybersecurity professionals is a significant challenge for Southeast Asian countries, with kind of building an awareness of cybersecurity as an important part, and kind of building on their level of cyber resilience in the region.
Really helpful point. Thanks, Millie. Just in terms of, I think, capacity building being something that, David has mentioned as well, a focus of the US government and, hopefully continuing area. Maybe same question for you, Nigel, in terms of, from your research, looking at Australia, looking at the region more generally, any insights into the impact that North Korean cyber operations have had globally, financially, and steps to address it?
Yeah, so from my research, definitely picking off of what David and Jenny both said, and Millie as well. When you look at the adoption of cryptocurrency by developing countries, this is extremely worrying because, of course, they don't quite have the digital means yet to protect themselves. So again, another low-hanging fruit for North Korean hackers, but also as well, I think the general trend of the digitization of our economic framework. So for example, the Biden administration's adoption of IPEF, or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. One of the key tenets of that is digital trade. I think as we continue to go on this digital trend within our economic transactions, it just creates more vulnerabilities. And as Millie, Jenny, and David both said as well, the capacity building for not only ourselves, but also our partners is something that's extremely concerning and is something that needs to be addressed.
Really great. Thank you, Nigel. And yeah, maybe kicking the question to you as well, David, in terms of the approach the Biden administration has taken and, greater cooperation through like the global, the ransomware, countering ransomware initiative, and wondering if you could shed any insight into how the US is looking at, the issue of North Korean cyber-enabled financial operations and, international cooperation in this area.
Sure. Yeah. One of the ways that, and I'm going to speak largely about what the Treasury Department is doing. One of the ways that we're trying to affect this particular arena is by trying to strengthen the virtual asset ecosystem. And one way that my office is spearheading that effort is through the Financial Action Task Force, commonly known as the FATF. And what we're trying to do is basically standardize across basically the globe and just a baseline set of standards that countries will implement using their domestic laws and authorities, so that there is this baseline that every country has when it comes to implementing certain rules, regulations, stuff that would help protect or would strengthen the virtual asset ecosystem, globally speaking, but also within their jurisdiction. And so we're working very closely. I mean, this isn't just a Treasury effort. We're working very closely with other departments and agencies in the U.S. government, along with other allies and partners who are FATF member states, to really push forward on developing these standards, much like we did in the anti-money laundering, countering this financing of terrorism context, as well as countering proliferation financing. So that more and more countries understand the importance of these standards and are willing to participate in the discussions to help set a baseline standard that eventually that the members will go back and encourage their domestic lawmakers to pass the appropriate regulations. I think in doing so, we would be able to attack this issue of North Korean cyber, right? For a lot of these countries, approaching them in the context of strengthening the virtual asset ecosystem is going to be a lot more attractive, and it's going to be a lot easier to persuade than specifically calling out, hey, we need your assistance on countering DPRK, illicit cyber activity. Because for them, DPRK cyber may not necessarily be a priority issue for them, but strengthening the virtual asset ecosystem is, for the reasons that Millie, Jenny, and Nigel have already mentioned about making sure the jurisdiction is in an area where it's a money laundering concern, particularly when it comes to virtual assets.
Sorry, a little trouble unmuting there, but yeah, really helpful insights, David. I think the any effort to address national security challenge, especially in cyberspace at this point, not a matter of just governments, but private sector, tech vendors in emerging tech spaces, virtual asset vendors. So I appreciate your highlighting that. And I think it'd be great to take the angle that you've been taking in terms of thinking broad, more actors being involved, and take that to the North Korea threat landscape as well, in terms of, we've seen a couple of different actors involved in North Korea's development of cyber strategy, cyber capabilities. I'm wondering if I can direct a question to you, Millie, in terms of focusing on kind of the research that you've done on China and North Korea's cooperation on like AI development and education. What role have you seen foreign actors, both state and non-state there, play in North Korea's development of cyber capabilities and strategy?
Yeah, thank you, Joan. For this question, I think I really want to focus on the talent component for North Korea's cyber strategy. Obviously, this training and access to resources is one of the most important key factors for North Korea's progress in carrying out its cyber strategy. And specifically in my research, I focused on strengthened science and tech collaboration between North Korea and China, and how that's been sustained even in emerging technologies such as AI. We see Chinese researchers and researchers from North Korean universities publishing co-authored journal publications in international journals about emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, covering deep learning and convolutional neural networks. And so this kind of sustained and comprehensive, I guess it shows a sustained and comprehensive picture of what sustained North Korea Chinese scientific research cooperation looks like. And so kind of the role of a country like China offering kind of the space for education and training for North Korean cyber agents. And back in 2016, South Korean cybersecurity firm estimated approximately 600 to 1,000 North Korean cyber agents operate and also train in China. And so the kind of access that China provides in training North Korea's talent is definitely one of the key areas that policymakers should be addressing and also focusing on. And I think recently, or one of the reports that I found encountered during my study was a piece published by the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, and it looked at how North Korea's SNT collaboration with foreign scientists does involve some dual-use research and research that has applications for the military. So between I think it was the 1950s and 2018, there were notable collaborations between Chinese researchers and North Korean researchers that dealt with sensitive dual-use research, including the detection and mitigation of denial of service attacks, which obviously has implications for North Korea's cyber strategy. And so while limited open source research and kind of access to information about how comprehensive North Korean talent or a North Korean presence is in China, studying and having access to these resources, there are potential risks associated with, continued educational exchange and SNT collaboration between the two countries. And so there's, I think, a need to identify and kind of address not only the tangible technologies and restricting access to technologies, but pathways for how education and knowledge transfer can train talent for North Korea's cyber strategy.
And really helpful insights. Thank you. And I think some of the work you've done looking at the specific types of cooperation that North Korean research and Chinese researchers have done in terms of looking into the applications of AI, machine learning, some really interesting insights that are open source as well. Jenny, I know you've looked into a similar area, and I was wondering if you had any comments you'd like to add. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, so in terms of foreign actors, we can think about non-state and also state, right? So non-state actors, the vast majority of North Korea's cyber criminal activities involve other criminal collaborators, right? So like first, they need to convert whatever cryptocurrency that they're holding into fiat currency and like gift cards or casino chips of some kind. And this process is almost always carried out in countries outside of North Korea, helped by nationals either in that country or third-party nationals, right? So like in 2020, 2 Chinese nationals were indicted, for doing just this. Second kind of collaborators involve, like organized crime, because some of these schemes require a lot of foot soldiers, right? So like especially things like ATM cash out schemes. So we saw from the last year's indictment that North Korea collaborated with a money launderer who used his network of co-conspirators to facilitate ATM cash outs in India. We also saw from the New Yorker article that there is collaboration going on with the Yakuza in Japan, again on ATM cash outs. And so I think there's some parts of the criminal enterprise, like make a natural case for alliance with existing organized crime. And third, we've seen certain anecdotes in which sort of North Korea acted themselves as hackers for hire, or purchased initial access to certain targets through like just simply buying or working with cyber criminal groups and using things like TrickBot and things like that. So there's collaboration going on that level as well. In terms of states, I think some of this has been covered again, so I'll sort of keep it short, but there are these sort of third-party states in which North Korea operates out of or transits through its cyber activities. And so figuring out how to get their cooperation based on certain issues or after certain incidents is going to be a challenge. I think, there were some ideas in the past about like applying ideas of due diligence and state responsibility in cyberspace. I think a lot of that didn't get much traction precisely because, like we don't want to also be held liable for the same norms as we want to hold them liable. So I think, some practical ways to do that would be to, tell them, hey, there is this national in your country that we need to, prosecute and extradite, please send them over. And the more and more that kind of practical cooperation occurs, maybe that also sends a signal back to the North Korean operators that, oh, like Malaysia is no longer a safe country to operate out of, we need to move base. And the more and more we do that, maybe this helps kind of reduce the footprint of their overseas operations. Yeah.
No, really, really helpful. Thank you, Jenny. I'm wondering, I think same question to you, David. I'm wondering, from your perch, if you've observed any, foreign actors, whether state or non-state, that you're able to speak of that are really informing North Korea's development of its cyber strategy or its capabilities.
Yeah, June, when you say foreign, are you talking about literally foreign or just like non-government here?
Really non-government.
Okay. Yeah, there have been a lot of great work really highlighting North Korea's illicit cyber activities. I think China Analysis has done some good work. I think Ashley was just on the earlier panel, and she's done some great work, and we're often discussions with her. I think the efforts that researchers like Nigel, Millie, and Jenny, and others have done is really, I think, brought this issue to the forefront. And I think other non-government actors are really paying attention to it. Like financial institutions are often interested in what's going on, particularly when it comes to cryptocurrency and any illicit activity. So that would obviously involve DPRK, illicit cyber activity. A lot of financial institutions, as well as just, I guess, regular firms are paying a lot of attention. And earlier this year, Treasury, along with state, and I think it was FBI, released a IT workers advisory, and that has caught a lot of attention. And so private firms are referring to that. We lay out how North Korea uses IT workers to gather illicit funds, how they launder it, how it's sent back to North Korea, and so that's always a good resource for a lot of these non-government actors, and we constantly engage with them. And it's not just Treasury and state, FBI. There's other agencies as well, like DHS. CISA does a lot of good work putting out advisories, and firms pay attention to this. And when we do our engagements with them, they do come and talk to us and say, hey, this was useful. This wasn't useful in the future. This is an area where we could use a little bit more information. So we have this ongoing discussion. In the end, I think that they have a stake in this as well, right? We've mentioned this earlier. They don't want to be known as an institution or an entity involved in dirty money, right? So there's definitely an incentive for them to chat with, to obviously discuss with us, but also work with us to counter illicit financing.
Really helpful. Thank you, David. And I think the public-private coordination, the communication themes that we're coming back to over and over in this panel. So really glad you highlighted that. And for the sake of time, I think we're going to have to move into our last question, a quick lightning round. But I'd love for all of the panelists to provide 20, 30-second responses, almost like a final takeaway recommendation. And the question is, what further action should the US and partner countries take in response to North Korea's cyber activities? And we'll go Jenny, David, Nigel, and Millie. So Jenny, if you'd like to start us off.
Thanks. I think having more of a comment on the approach rather than what. I think making the cooperation as specific as possible, issue-oriented, focusing on practical areas of cooperation first. And then I think the norms will follow as an interaction of that rather than try to do it vice versa. And I think, the initiatives on ransomware, the cracking down on crypto ecosystem, I think those are, both promising signs. And I do agree with David that, it's probably better to couch this issue in that way rather than to focus on, like, hey, this is a North Korea crime issue. Like, we want to have a strategic sort of angle to this. So I think taking those practical routes are good. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenny. Over to you, David.
Yeah, let me answer this from a very treasury perspective. I think one thing that would help would be for a lot of these countries to adopt a unique cyber authority. Very few countries, if any, have it. We have Executive Order 13694, and that gives us a lot of latitude to go after cyber actors. We've taken action using that authority. Like Blender.io was an action we took earlier this year, a mixer that laundered North Koreans stolen virtual assets. So I think that would certainly help. Certainly getting more provisions in UN Security Council resolutions, although that is another issue in of itself in the current time period. But if we're able to highlight cyber more and getting those into the UNSCRs, I think would help a lot, because that's international law that member states are all obligated to follow. So I think from those perspectives, I think, or those actions would certainly help in terms of really advancing this issue from a very sanctions perspective.
Great, thank you so much. And over to you, Nigel.
Yeah, of course. So I would look at it in a two-way or a two-pronged approach. So increasing or scoping interoperability, while also focusing on looking at future trends within North Korean cyber operations. So in terms of increasing operability and scoping interoperability, as Jenny said, looking at the practical things that we can actually implement, while also looking towards the future trends that North Korea may be looking at, whether in illicit finance, whether in disinformation campaigns, and essentially learning from everybody's own experiences, whether it's learning from the Bangladesh heist, whether learning from disinformation campaigns within South Korea, and just trying to build off that and preparing for, the next trend. North Korean hackers have shown that they're extremely flexible and that they learn very quickly. So essentially trying to increase that interoperability while also preparing for those future trends that are going to come up in the next 5 or 10 years.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nigel. And finally, Millie, last word for you.
Yeah, I think it'd be important to get countries that share the common threat perception of North Korean cyber operations to work together by overcoming structural differences in how each country handles and manages cyber threats. So kind of building on the momentum of multilateral cyber exercises to make progress on the US, ROK, Japan trilateral cybersecurity cooperation, for example, and also greater integration of cybercrime-related information sharing and capacity building, especially with partners and allies in Southeast Asia. And then finally, again, the talent component of addressing how specialized teaching and transfer of knowledge contributes and can facilitate North Korea's development of cyber talent.
Perfect. Thank you so much for everyone for joining. This was a very wide-ranging panel, and I appreciate everyone taking the time on a Thursday evening. And with that, I think I will hand it over to Alex for closing remarks. Thank you again.
Thanks, June, and congrats to all you guys on a great panel discussion. As we wrap up, I just want to take a moment to speak a little bit about our working group's goals and priorities going forward. As John and June said in their opening remarks, two key elements of our mission are to cultivate the next generation of analysts looking at North Korean cyber issues and to generate valuable, fresh thinking. I think today's event has helped advance both of those goals. Alongside our established partners, we heard from 4 of our NextGen and KCWG members, Ah-Young, Helen, Millie, and Nigel, who have been conducting research on these topics and have in several cases published their preliminary findings in outlets such as The Diplomat and The National Interest. In support of those goals, cultivating the next generation and generating useful insights, our working group has scaled up its activities during its second year of operation, which ends with today's conference. This year, we've expanded our membership, both in terms of raw numbers and in terms of the fields represented by our membership. The current membership includes a range of backgrounds from think tank researchers and Kennedy School students to private sector security consultants, and further to practitioners who are focused on the security of our energy infrastructure and on cyber competition with US adversaries in East Asia, to name just a few. Moreover, we've expanded our research portfolio. During our first year in 2021, we sponsored 1 research project. This year, our members are conducting 4, which range from case studies of particular incidents and policy suggestions to longer studies of how emerging technologies like artificial intelligence may affect North Korea's cyber program. We've also held more skills development workshops and closed sessions featuring conversations with experts and serving practitioners. We'd like to encourage next-gen researchers working in this field to reach out. You can find our contact information on the Career Projects page on the Belfer Center website. Looking ahead, we'll continue to build on what we've achieved so far. In the coming months, we'll be publishing a number of our members' reports, and next year we plan to increase the number of research projects we're conducting even further. We also plan to expand our public programming. As we continue to build out our in-person and hybrid presence, we're looking to hold a number of events during the spring semester, including seminars, panel discussions like the ones we held today, and interviews with experts and serving practitioners. We're also planning to introduce networking events for next generation researchers working in this field, and we'll have more to share on all of these in the coming months. So I'd like to close with just a few thank yous. First and foremost to June Lee, Millie Kim, and the North Korea Cyber Working Group membership for their fantastic work, without which today's conference would not be possible. I want to say a special thanks to our external speakers, so Jackie, Ashley, Prashil, David, and Jenny. Thank you all for sharing your valuable time with us and with our audience. A very special thank you to John Park and to Lauren Zabrick for their crucial support of the working group. And I want to note that we are especially inspired by the outstanding work that Lauren and many others have done with Share the Mic in Cyber. We'd like to acknowledge the generous support of the SBS Foundation Research Fund at Harvard University's Korea Institute. And finally, we'd like to say a big thank you to our audience for tuning in today. We look forward to seeing you at another event soon. Thank you very much. Have a good night.